The snow was falling in that cinematic way that makes Georgetown look like it's auditioning for a Christmas movie when Miranda Sloan pushed open the glass doors of Aurelia Fine Jewelry. To anyone else, it was just another luxury boutique, but to Miranda, it was something much more personal. Her creation, her vision, her empire. She should have been welcomed like royalty. Instead, she walked in looking more like someone who'd taken a wrong turn while Googling nearest bakery. Her boots had scuffs. Her coat was the kind that said, "I value warmth over logos." And her hair, still damp from the snow, definitely hadn't seen the inside of a professional blow-dry bar that morning. If you were expecting a billionaire founder to sweep in with a Chanel bag in one hand and a latte in the other, you'd have been disappointed. She carried only two things: her phone and a silver bracelet, the same one she'd bought from a flea market before she even dreamed of owning a company. Behind the counter, Priscilla Denton, the store manager, gave Miranda the kind of up-and-down look usually reserved for suspicious characters at open-bar weddings. To Priscilla, Miranda wasn't a founder or a VIP. She was just another walk-in with wet boots who would probably leave fingerprints on the glass displays. What no one realized, yet, was that Miranda wasn't here to browse, to window shop, or to pass the time before lunch. She was here to take the temperature of her flagship store. And, spoiler alert, the results were about to be feverish. Miranda hadn't taken 3 steps into the boutique before the hierarchy of judgment began its silent ballet. Priscilla Denton, keeper of the glass cases and self-declared ambassador of refinement, leaned ever so slightly on the counter, narrowing her eyes with the precision of someone who had perfected this art. The store itself was a vision of perfection. Velvet displays glowing under carefully angled spotlights, a playlist of soft jazz trying its best to sound spontaneous, though it had been looping for 6 months straight, and glass shelves polished so obsessively that you could check your teeth in them before spending 6 figures. On paper, everything was flawless. In practice, one small thing was about to topple the illusion: Priscilla's instinct to categorize. She didn't see Miranda Sloan, founder and sole owner of Aurelia Fine Jewelry. She saw woman in boots. She saw coat that probably came from a department store. She saw someone who, in her mind, was much more likely to buy a scented candle than a diamond necklace. And so, she dismissed her. Not with words at first. Oh no, Priscilla was far subtler than that. But with the carefully perfected art of ignoring. Miranda moved slowly, stopping in front of a case that held the Elysian collection, a line she herself had designed down to the very hinge of each clasp. She didn't need to read the plaques, or the marketing copy, or the outrageous price tags. She knew them all by heart. They were, after all, hers. Across the room, Nadia Tran, the junior associate polishing earrings at the far wall, felt a strange flutter in her chest. She didn't recognize Miranda outright, but there was something about the way she carried herself, something steady, grounded, quietly commanding, that made Nadia hesitate. She had a vague memory of a company-wide email, the kind she had skimmed while scrolling TikTok, about the founder possibly visiting stores unannounced. Could it be? But Priscilla, blissfully unaware, forged ahead with her favorite performance, the gentle but unmistakable dismissal. She stepped forward, smiling like a cat about to nudge a glass off a table, and gestured to the seasonal display of more approachable pieces by the door. She didn't say you don't belong here. She didn't have to. The suggestion was baked into her tone. Miranda, however, did not budge. She stood with the stillness of someone watching a house of cards tremble in the draft. To Priscilla, it looked like defiance. To Nadia, it looked like recognition. To Miranda, it was simply patience. And then, Priscilla made her move. She nodded to Dennis Ward, the security guard by the entrance who had been scrolling through his phone with the dedication of a man following 3 fantasy football leagues. Dennis sighed, tucked his phone away, and began to walk toward Miranda. That's when Miranda calmly reached into her coat pocket. Not for an ID, not for cash, not for her car keys. She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen with a quiet authority that made the air shift. The call wasn't to customer service. It wasn't to HR. It wasn't illegal. It was something higher. And suddenly, Nadia knew. The boutique was no longer just a boutique. It was a stage. Customers glanced up from their browsing, sensing that something unscripted was about to happen. Employees froze, caught between protocol and curiosity. Even the jazz music in the background suddenly felt too loud, as though it were intruding on a scene it had no right to soundtrack. Miranda Sloan hadn't come to shop. She had come to witness. She had come to test what her company had become when stripped of press releases and polished mission statements. And what she had seen, in less than 5 minutes, was enough to confirm her suspicion. Elegance had been reduced to exclusion. Dennis, the security guard, slowed, uncertain. He'd dealt with unruly guests before, but something about Miranda's calm unnerved him. It was the opposite of what he expected. No raised voice, no defensive scrambling, just composure, absolute and unshakable, like someone who knew the ending to a story everyone else was still stumbling through. Priscilla, meanwhile, adjusted her pearl necklace, which may or may not have been faux. Miranda could tell, of course, but she wasn't about to ruin the woman's secret. She stood taller, preparing to deliver her next carefully scripted line of exclusive policy, when Miranda placed her phone gently on the counter. The illuminated screen reflected against the glass, and though no one could quite make out what was on it, the effect was enough. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, simple, and devastating. Nadia gasped softly, her eyes flicking to the silver bracelet on Miranda's wrist. She had seen it before, engraved in the training packets, mentioned in every origin story the company loved to market. That bracelet was the beginning of Aurelia Fine Jewelry. It was the talisman, the signature, the seed from which the empire grew. And suddenly, the room shifted. Customers leaned in. Employees stilled. Dennis stepped back. Priscilla was still smiling, but the cracks were showing. She had built her confidence on appearances, and appearances had just betrayed her. Because what stood before her wasn't just a customer, it wasn't even just a wealthy woman. It was the reason she had a job, the reason the store existed, the reason the lights were on and the cases full. Miranda Sloan hadn't come for jewelry. She had come for accountability. And in 5 minutes, Priscilla Denton would learn what happens when arrogance collides with truth and loses. The boutique, which had only moments earlier hummed with soft jazz and the polite shuffle of customers examining cases, now felt like someone had pressed the mute button on reality. A silence spread. Not the comfortable kind, but the sort that tightens the air until even the most expensive diamonds in the room looked nervous under the spotlight. Miranda Sloan stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on the counter, the silver bracelet on her wrist catching the glow of the lights. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to be. But anyone who knew the history of Aurelia Fine Jewelry knew what that bracelet was. The brand's first piece. The seed. The legend. The bracelet that had been photographed, referenced, and romanticized in glossy features about how a single design sparked an empire. Yet here it was, dismissed as nothing more than a trinket by the very manager who was supposed to protect the brand's identity. Priscilla Denton, still unaware she was skating on the thinnest ice of her career, tried to recover with the kind of smile usually reserved for awkward dinner parties. But her performance was slipping. Her words, which had once felt like polished pearls, now dangled in the air like loose threads waiting to be pulled. Dennis Ward, the security guard, wisely stopped his advance. Something in Miranda's calm stopped him cold. He had worked enough events to know when someone was pretending to have authority and when someone truly owned the room. Miranda didn't look like she was pretending. She looked like she was the room. And in the back, Nadia Tran felt her heart hammer in her chest. She hadn't just recognized the bracelet. She now remembered the training video, the newsletters, the grainy but unmistakable photo of Miranda Sloan standing next to the mayor at the ribbon cutting 5 years ago. It wasn't a maybe. It wasn't a guess. This was her, the founder, the CEO. The person whose story Nadia had replayed in her head whenever she doubted if she belonged in luxury retail. Now here she was, in sneakers, with snow still melting in her hair, looking more like someone you'd ask to hold your spot in line at Starbucks than the billionaire architect of Aurelia Fine Jewelry. And that was the point. The energy in the boutique shifted so sharply it could have been a scene change in a play. One moment, it was a showroom run by Priscilla Denton, queen of side-eye and gatekeeping. The next, it was clearly the domain of Miranda Sloan, whose authority didn't need an introduction, it only needed to be noticed. Customers who had pretended not to eavesdrop now leaned in, their bodies angled like human parentheses around the unfolding moment. A man with cufflinks, shaped like tiny sailing boats, discreetly put down the diamond cufflinks he'd been considering. A young woman with an Hermes scarf pulled her phone out, screen angled carefully, as if capturing history in real time. Priscilla, meanwhile, had gone pale. The realization hadn't fully bloomed yet, but the roots of doubt were spreading fast. She began to sense what Dennis and Nadia already knew. She wasn't dealing with a difficult customer. She was standing in front of the owner. Miranda picked up her phone again, tapping the screen with the same unhurried certainty of someone checking the time before a meeting she herself had scheduled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But the effect was devastating. Every second that passed without her speaking was a second where Priscilla's authority evaporated like mist on glass. Nadia could feel it, the shift, the inversion of power, the quiet justice unfolding right in front of her. And though no one had said the words out loud, the truth was now obvious. The woman who had been told to step aside was, in fact, the woman who had built the very ground they were standing on. Miranda didn't need to deliver a monologue or flash a title card. She simply adjusted the angle of the nearest display case, correcting the slightly crooked spotlight with a subtle movement. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it was seismic. It said, "I see everything. I built this, and I will fix what has gone wrong." Priscilla Denton hadn't just misjudged a customer. She had misjudged the soul of Aurelia Fine Jewelry. And in less than 5 minutes, that mistake was about to cost her everything. If boutiques had weather reports, the forecast inside Aurelia Fine Jewelry had gone from pleasantly exclusive to severe internal storm warning. What once felt like a sanctuary of velvet and diamonds now pulsed with tension so thick it could have been cut with one of the store's platinum letter openers. Miranda Sloan hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lifted a finger, but somehow she had rewritten the entire atmosphere. Customers stood frozen. Associates hovered like actors waiting for their cue, and even the jazz music, poor, oblivious jazz, seemed to falter, as if the saxophonist sensed the drama from miles away. Priscilla Denton's smile was collapsing. For years she had wielded authority like a fencing foil, graceful, sharp, and always on her terms. But now it clattered uselessly to the floor, because no amount of polished posture could disguise the reality. She had dismissed the very person who built this place. Her arms, once confidently folded, now clung to her clipboard like it was a life raft on the Titanic. She glanced at Dennis, but Dennis, ever pragmatic, had stepped politely back, suddenly very interested in rearranging brochures. She glanced at Nadia, but Nadia's wide eyes and flushed cheeks screamed, "Oh no, you're on your own now." Miranda didn't look at Priscilla at all. That, in itself, was the final insult. She didn't need to. She was already beyond her. Instead, she placed her phone flat on the counter, the Aurelia corporate crest glowing faintly on the case. The gesture was small, but the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This wasn't a customer making a complaint. This was an owner opening a file. Priscilla realized then that her career had developed a very sudden expiration date, and the countdown had already begun. Miranda walked slowly across the boutique, pausing not at the center displays or the lavish spotlighted cases, but at the smaller, overlooked details. She straightened a tray of rings that had been tilted off balance, adjusted a crooked spotlight, ran her finger gently across a velvet display to brush away the faintest trace of dust. None of it was theatrical. None of it was for show. But in the silence, each tiny act landed like a verdict. The staff was riveted. Nadia Tran, the junior associate, felt her chest tighten with a strange mix of terror and relief. Terror at what this meant for the team, relief that the truth was out. She wasn't just watching her boss's boss. She was watching the reason she'd taken the job, the person whose story had inspired her during orientation when she doubted whether she belonged. Priscilla Denton, meanwhile, looked like a ghost haunting her own boutique. The clipboard trembled slightly in her hand. Her well-practiced veneer of exclusivity was cracking wide open, and with every silent movement Miranda made, the cracks deepened. She had thought herself untouchable, the guardian of the store's image. But the real image, the truth of what Aurelia stood for, was embodied in the woman she had brushed aside in snow-damp boots. Customers whispered. Phones recorded discreetly. One man coughed, then looked horrified at the noise he'd made. It was that kind of silence, the sacred, electric, courtroom kind, where everyone knows the verdict is coming, but no one knows how loud it will land. And then Miranda turned, her gaze sweeping the room. She didn't need to say a word. Her expression alone carried the judgment. Appearances had been mistaken for value, and now the store would pay the price. The boutique had never been so quiet. Every eye in the room was fixed on Miranda Sloan, not because she demanded it, but because her very presence made silence the only option. She stood in the center of the space she had imagined years ago, the flagship of her vision, and she looked at it now not as a customer, not even as an executive, but as its guardian. What she saw was not just glass cases and diamonds. She saw culture, choices, the way people decided, in unguarded moments, who was worthy and who was not. Those choices spoke louder than any marketing campaign or polished press release ever could. And today, the choices had failed. Priscilla Denton had stopped speaking altogether. She no longer had words, only regret. She had assumed power came from holding people at a distance, from guarding prestige like a locked vault. But power, Miranda knew, had always come from the opposite, from opening the doors, from inviting people in, from treating every individual with dignity. Miranda reached for her phone again. Not hurried, not angry. Calm. She typed a short message to her board, her senior team, and HR. It was not a request. It was a directive, a record of what had just unfolded, and an outline of what would happen next. The act itself was simple, but for everyone watching, the staff, the customers, it was unmistakably final. Priscilla Denton's authority was gone. The store's hierarchy had been rewritten, and Miranda Sloan had shown, without raising her voice, that leadership does not always roar. Sometimes it corrects with silence. Sometimes it rebuilds with action. Miranda turned her attention to the people who had stood on the edges of the moment. The employees who had hesitated, the ones who had watched, and the one who had recognized her not through titles or policies, but through instinct. Nadia Tran. Miranda acknowledged her first. She didn't give a speech. She didn't grandstand. She simply recognized her in front of the team, calling her forward with a nod that carried more weight than any award. Nadia had noticed what others ignored. She had seen value before the reveal. That, Miranda knew, was leadership in its purest form. Nadia's role would grow. Her voice would be trusted. Next came Dennis Ward, the guard who had stopped himself before enforcing an unjust order. Miranda recognized the restraint it took to pause, to question, to think for himself. It wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. He would be honored for that discernment. The others who had stood idle, hesitant but not harmful, would be trained, mentored, given another chance to learn what this brand truly represented. For Miranda, accountability was not about punishment alone. It was about realignment. It was about ensuring that the soul of Aurelia Fine Jewelry lived in its people, not just its products. But for Priscilla Denton, there was no role left. Her departure was swift, quiet, and final. No spectacle, no public humiliation, just the truth revealed, and the consequences it carried. Miranda believed in accountability, not cruelty. And so Priscilla left the boutique she had once controlled, her absence leaving behind a lesson that no one present would ever forget. When it was done, the air itself felt different. Customers remained, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Employees stood straighter, their movements steadier, as though they had been reminded of something larger than sales quotas or exclusivity. Miranda Sloan had not come to shop. She had come to restore. And in doing so, she had turned a moment of division into a story of principle, one that would live long beyond the day itself. When the storm had passed, the boutique did not look different, yet it felt reborn. The cases still gleamed beneath their lights, the music still drifted gently from the speakers, and the same diamonds still sparkled like frozen fire. But what lingered now was not the weight of arrogance, it was the presence of clarity. Miranda Sloan stood in the center of the room, calm and unwavering. She had not needed to shout, she had not needed to stage a scene. Her lesson had been delivered through silence, through action, through the unshakable truth that values are not negotiable. She spoke finally, not to scold, but to anchor the moment. Her voice was steady, measured, and unmistakably clear. Respect, she reminded them, was not a luxury reserved for the few. It was the standard for all. Integrity was not something written in manuals. It was lived in every gesture, every decision, every word spoken in this space. And excellence, true excellence, had never been about exclusivity. It had always been about dignity. For the staff, the message was searing but necessary. What you allow is what you stand for, and what you stand for defines everything. For the customers, it was a reminder that luxury without humanity is hollow, that beauty means little when it excludes. In those few minutes, Miranda had turned a potential scandal into a moment of renewal. She had shown that leadership is not measured in titles or wealth, but in the courage to act with fairness when it matters most. As the day moved forward, the boutique returned to its rhythm. Customers resumed browsing, but with a new awareness in their eyes. Employees moved with purpose, not out of fear, but out of respect, for their founder, for their brand, for themselves. Miranda Sloan did not linger for praise. She adjusted one final display, straightened a case that had been left slightly askew, and with that simple act, she restored balance not just to the glass and velvet, but to the spirit of the store itself. Then she left as quietly as she had entered, her silver bracelet catching the light one last time before the door closed behind her. What remained was not anger, not humiliation, not spectacle. What remained was a lesson that would outlast the jewelry on display, a lesson carved deeper than diamonds. That leadership is quiet strength, that dignity is non-negotiable, and that justice, when carried out with calm conviction, is more powerful than any crown of gold. This is a fictional story. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. But the message is real. We stand against discrimination, and we believe in a world where respect, fairness, and dignity belong to everyone. If this story resonates with you, please subscribe, share it with others, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Together, we can make integrity louder than bias, and kindness stronger than exclusion.